We restart. It's really a pleasure, really, to have Matteo Grazzi here. I really wanted to have this perspective on beyond Europe and towards, in this case, Latin America and the Caribbean. So I leave the floor to Matteo, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Massimiliano, and thank you to the University of Ferrara and the Cercis for inviting me. It's really a pleasure being here for many reasons. Well, first of all, I'm Italian, and every occasion to be back is nice. The second thing is that it seems strange to me after so many years in Latin America, in the US, but working on Latin America to see research in Europe, mainly about Europe. And I felt extremely jealous because the data availability and the possibility of research that you have is completely different from the possibility that we have in the region. And this is a point that I wanted to make at the beginning because it will be back in the development of the presentation, and you will see in where later. First of all, before starting the presentation, I just wanted to comment a bit about the institution where I work, that is the Inter-American Development Bank, that possibly not many of you know, but is like the most important development finance source in Latin America. We have a portfolio of about $16 billion in development finance every year. We are present in almost all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, really all but Cuba and some small islands in the Caribbean. And we try to just mix finance with knowledge. So what we try to do is not just lending money, but lending, well, if we use the terminology of venture capital, smart money. So it comes loans, but with technical assistance and knowledge. So we tend to consider ourselves like a mix between a project manager and a researcher. And everything that we do, and you will see, has some kind of direct policy implication because it is the basis on which we negotiate with governments. So what we do is directly applied in policy. That is very nice. It's a very nice work on this side. But on the other side, obviously, brings us to work on very practical concept. One preliminary thing is also that I'm not speaking on behalf of the bank. That is a very bureaucratic institution and needs to be clear from the beginning. So this year, the IDB had his birthday number 60. So it's 60 years. It's since 1959 that we are in this development job. And you know, every time that there is a birthday, you think a bit about an important birthday, like every 10 years. You think a bit about what you have done, what you have achieved, if you have done things right, if you could have done this differently or not. And this is a bit of our reflection that I want to share with you. So I'm a development economist by formation, and I don't know now, but when I was studying my postgraduate studies, the golden standard of development economics was the catching up, you know, going and arrive to the level of the developed or more developed economies. So the first thing is trying to see if Latin America is actually catching up. So are we converging or we are not? So I tried to do this exercise in different dimensions. The first one is like life expectancy at birth. And if we see about 60 years, a bit less, it seems that the answer is yes. I mean, if we consider the difference between the US, that is a red line that is usually used as a benchmark in Latin America, and the blue line, that is the average of the region, well, you see that the difference was much bigger at the beginning of the period than now. So, I mean, it seems pretty optimistic. Maybe it has not been of the desired pace. We could have done that quicker. But at the same time, I mean, the tendency and the trend seems going in the right direction. And also, if we consider this as a shorter time frame because of differences in measurement and all data from the World Bank, if we consider the poverty and the inequality, not just poverty, on a regional basis, and this is from 2000, basically the last 20 years, we can also see that poverty is decreasing regionally. Inequality also, the Gini coefficient is decreasing. So the picture seems quite positive. There are huge heterogeneities in the region. Now we are considering Latin America as a homogeneous continent. It is not. Obviously coexist countries very developed with countries really poor and less developed, but still, let's say that on average, the picture seems positive. But, and now it's the bitter part of the bittersweet picture that I was mentioning at the beginning, let's try to see what happens in terms of economic development measured by GDP per capita obviously in purchase parity. So let's see how it goes to the continent in comparison with Latin America in this 60 years picture. And now the situation is a bit different because basically the relation between the GDP per capita in Latin America and the US is actually worsening. I mean, the continent is actually worse than in the situation at the beginning of our period. So if we had some kind of catching up in terms of like social indicators, in terms of general income, we are not catching up. Actually, the situation is even worse. And it could be replicated basically with other benchmark countries, with the OECD average, with Europe, and the situation wouldn't be very, very different. So the question here is why? And here you can see a simple exercise of growth accountancy, trying to decompose what was the economic growth of the region since 1960 to 2010, I think, where we have data. And actually, it is clear that it was due to factor accumulation and not to productivity. So it was an economic growth that was really driven not by technological advance and productivity, that is at the end of the day the engine of long-term development, but by capital and especially labor accumulation. And this is a main problem for a region that wants to achieve sustainable development. This has not happened, for example, in some benchmark countries, like, for example, East Asia and Pacific. The example, and we will be back to that later, the classical example is Korea, in South Korea, that was much worse than the average Latin American country in the 60s, was more or less at the level of the average Latin America in the 80s, and now is obviously a developed country. And the difference is about this, is about what was the main driver of growth. In the case of East Asia was productivity growth. In the case of Latin America, productivity growth was basically zero. And here there is another way to see the same thing with the benchmark countries that I told you about, the typical East Asian. And you see that if we compare the productivity of Latin America with the productivity of the US, and we have as a base year 1960, the blue line is much worse than now, or at least in 2010 when it was the last measurement of productivity, but it's not different now after 10 years. Okay, so we know that Latin America is doing good in some kind of indicators, is doing not that good in terms of economic development measured by GDP. But today is about, innovation, productivity, but also environment and circular economy. So I tried to see some kind of indicators to give you an idea of how it is going in the region also from other point of view. I mean, from the point of view of more environmental indicators and not economic ones. So I started with emissions, that unfortunately it is a very hot topic in these days after what happened in Madrid and the failure of the conference. And well, if we see is that if we do the same exercises of the previous slide, I mean comparing what is the emission per capita compared to the US, the situation is not that nice, because our emission, I mean the emission per capita of the Latin American countries are actually growing compared with what was at the beginning of our period, that is 1990, that was the first year where they were measured. So basically it is a counter tendency, and we would have preferred to have the previous slide going up and this going down, but it is the other way around. And this is basically putting the two graphs together. So at this moment, basically we have the same percentage of GDP and emission than the US. That is not really a nice target in terms of emissions. Because if we see what happened with Germany, that has much less emission than the US, once checked for economic structure and GDP, you see that Latin America is really going up in terms of emissions. So the situation in terms of environment is not that nice. And this is really confirmed by the data that I found of the Inclusive Wealth Report. Actually, yesterday when I saw Professor Managi's presentation, I was curious. I didn't know about the data of Latin America, but I made my homework yesterday afternoon, and I tried to check how was going the region also in terms of these indicators. The answer is, well, you can see that. I mean, all the indicators are going down, so we are not doing very well. But at the same time, also all the other regions are doing not so well. So I mean, it's a common tragedy, unfortunately. What it is a bit more strange is that when we decompose the indicator and we see the growth rate of the indicator in the last basically 15 years until 2014 by country, we have some striking surprise, because it seems that who is growing more and increasing more the value of this indicator are countries that we wouldn't have expected. I mean, the first one is Venezuela, and probably you know that is not a very good moment for the country. It hasn't been for the last at least 15 years. So it's a bit striking to have Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Cuba as like the 4 top performers, even if it is annual growth. And we were discussing earlier with Professor Managi, and I suspect that it is back to data. So again, it is like a bit of a confirmation of what I was saying at the beginning, that working in the environment of Latin America is a bit different than working in the European environment, because you have to be very careful of what data you are using. There are few data and not often very reliable. And this is a real challenge if you want to understand more and then, produce evidence to after give policy advice for some public policy based on evidence. So you have data, all this chain that is like a virtual chain that help countries to do better decision is very weak. Well, and just to finish with like indicators, at least in general, I also found some indicators of solid waste. This is from a project of our friends of the World Bank, in a project very interesting that is called water waste, that probably a lot of you know. And it is about the total annual solid waste that countries produce. And we have made just a small exercise. We found it in terms of per capita, and not too surprisingly, we see that a selection of Latin America and the Caribbean countries is actually producing less waste than our benchmark country, that is Germany. So it is about, like 0.6 tons per capita a year in Germany, and Latin American countries produce between 0.3 and 0.4, more or less. But if we consider what is the same information but normalized by GDP, the situation is a bit different, because we see that basically Germany is producing much more using less resources and producing less waste. And this is completely coherent with our productivity hypothesis, because if they are producing more with the same amount of resources and they are wasting less, obviously the situation is this, where Jamaica, for example, is the main waster of the region, with more than 70 grams for each dollar of GDP every year. It's a bit striking. When I found this number, I was saying each dollar, on average, is like 100, almost one hectogram of solid waste every year. That is like a lot, I would say. Okay, and so we see that the situation in terms of environment out of the region is not very nice, and also the problem is that Latin America has a set of characteristics that make the region very vulnerable and with a lot of possible negative impact from climate change and environmental deterioration in general. First of all, Latin America is the world's most urbanized region. It means a lot of residual, a lot of urban waste. There is a really shocking information from a work of Galarza of 3 or 4 years ago that say that in Latin America we have every year more than 50,000 of people who is dying prematurely because of air pollution. So it's something that really affects directly what is the health of the population. And this is a graph that is not just for Latin America, but is like to make you think about a bit of the urgency. I know that that is normal and you read on the paper, but when I saw this graph in The Economist, I think like a couple of months ago, it seemed to me very good to basically indicate what is the situation and what will be the situation in the future in terms of increase of temperature. So this is a very long time span. So it is since the start of 1900 or of the late 19th century. and until now, and each vertical line is a year. If it is blue, it means that the year average temperature was less than the average temperature of the whole period. If it is red or reddish, it seems that it's hotter. Well, you can see what's happening in the last 20 or 25 years. Unfortunately, there was not this graph divided by region. This is like a world average, but still, I mean, this is basically the situation that we will be facing in the next year. And why I'm saying that it will be an impact very strong for Latin America, because when you have a region that is still very dependent on natural resources, the impact is very direct. For example, this is like a very nice region in Colombia where it grows coffee, and the estimation about coffee field, I mean, the amount of area suitable for growing coffee will be reduced by 50% in Latin America in the next 30 years. So if you have economies that are still very reliable in natural resources, climate change can have an impact that is much more direct than economies that are more reliable in transformation of resources. And also in terms of biodiversity, for example, Latin America is very rich of what they are called the biodiverse hotspots. I think that 3 of the 5 countries more biodiverse in the world are in Latin America: Brazil, Colombia, and I don't remember the third one, possibly Costa Rica, but I'm not sure. And clearly, the climate change is already affecting biodiversity. You know that, for example, corals in all the Carribean Sea are dying right now because of the rise in temperature. And this is not only affecting what is tourism and economic activity and also human well-being of the region, but it's also in some ways affecting the potential for development of the region, because right now we are talking a lot about what can mean biodiversity as an engine of development through, for example, biotechnology. So it seems that it could be like a resource to be used in the future in order to get a sustainable development. But if biodiversity is being reduced, also this potential productive factor is really disappearing. So I really hope to not have depressed you a lot with these slides, but unfortunately this is a bit of the situation that we deal with every day. So, being back to our long-term growth determinants, I think that most of the persons here that are scholars of innovation, for example, can agree that innovation is one of the key determinants of long-term growth. We have a huge amount of literature, both at macro level, at micro level, that the relation really stands clear, together with some other factors like, for example, human capital and education. And this is a simple correlation between total factor productivity and R&D expenditure that is a globally accepted proxy for the innovation effort of a country, and basically it is clear that at least in terms of correlation, it stands. And well, if you remember that I was mentioning Korea as an example of a country that has managed to use innovation as a tool, as an engine for economic development, you can see the difference between 2000 and 2011 in what has been the effort in terms of percentage of GDP of Korea compared to Latin America. Basically, in Latin America, this is stable, and the tendency is a bit depressive, while you see that the tendency increases in this year from Korea. So the main point here is that innovation matters, and it is important not just for economic development, but also for economic development that should be sustainable and less harmful for the environment. And we have evidence that this relation stands specifically for Latin America. We have produced a lot of studies, as I was mentioning, both using macro data, and using the innovation survey that we have in Latin America. There is not a Latin America statistical agency, there is not a Eurostat in Latin America, but yes, we have innovation surveys that usually are basically modeled on the Oslo manual. They are not 100% comparable, they are not usually panel. I mean, they are not of the same sophistication of the statistical instrument that you have in Europe, but still we have done a lot of research using the data that we have. And basically we found that it's clear that innovative firms has an impact, are more productive than non-innovative firms. So if this relation stands, you would expect that the normal policymaker that knows what to do in terms of investing to promote economic development would have done it. I mean, if I know that if I invest in education and in science, I would get returns in terms of development, one could say that it's easy to do. And also because there is evidence of the World Bank in a joint work that we have done with the World Bank that the returns in terms of growth for developing countries are much higher than the returns of already developed countries. So, I mean, said this, there will be like an additional reason in order to increase the investment in these areas. Unfortunately, the situation is not this. This is the classical graph that shows what is the innovation effort in the regional country compared with benchmarking countries in other regions. And you see that most countries in Latin America basically invest in R&D less than 0.5% of its GDP. That is a very low level if you want to have a development strategy based on science, technology, and innovation. Actually, these are data, I think, of 2015 or something like that. Situation hasn't changed. The only country that had more than 1% of its GDP dedicated to R&D was Brazil. That is a bit of a particular, it's a particular island in the Latin American context because of the different language, but also because of the market size that is a continent on its own. So Latin America is not really investing in innovation. And if we use other indicators that are commonly used in order to evaluate what is innovation performance in terms, for example, innovation input of specialized human capital, well, this is a nice graph that are really clear about what is the percentage of researchers in the labor force in the US and OECD compared on the researchers in Latin America. So I think it's self-explaining. But then, what can we do? What could do an institution like the one where I work on in public policy? The good news is that it has been very proved that the state can play and the government can play a role in order to stimulate innovation in the private sector. We have done a lot of evaluation of instruments of policy, and the results are that effectively it's possible to increase innovation with public instruments. Even if it's possible, unfortunately, there is not a lot of public financing available for this kind of activities. Again, this is a bit earlier, in 2010, and you can see basically what has been the percentage of firms that have received public support for innovation and science technology in some Latin American countries where we have reliable data compared with benchmark countries. And as usually, unfortunately, Latin American countries stand at the right tail of the graph. So I think that at this point we all agree that innovation is important, and not just because it increases productivity, but also because it helps to have an economic growth that could be more sustainable and environmentally sustainable. And we arrive, after this 20 minutes, to the main topic of the conversation of today, that is eco-innovation or green innovation or sustainable innovation. We use the same term here, that is basically trying to understand if innovation, that is important for productivity goals, could be also used in order to benefit the environment. So we use the definition. We have talked a lot about circular economy and eco-innovation in these days. We have seen that there are many definitions, hundreds of these definitions was mentioned earlier today. And we basically use this European Commission one where there are these main two elements. That is one, that is something that is good for the business, and the other thing that is something that is good for the environment. This is like trying to simplify a lot. And these include the creation and commercialization of technologies and also some other kind of innovation, not just technological ones, but especially technology, but also, and this is particularly important in the context of Latin America, and I suspect in the context of most developing regions, it includes also the diffusion and adoption of technology already existing on the market. And this is an important point when we arrive at the moment of measuring what is green innovation in Latin America. And why it is important? Well, this is very clear. It guarantees the provision of resources to our generation, but also to future generation, and generates possibly new jobs and productivity gains, as we have seen today. And obviously, it is a shift of the model to a model that could be more socially and environmentally just. This is a citation that I always want to show, is by René Kemp, that has been co-author of many of the people here in the room. Is also my co-author, and he basically stated the importance of technology diffusion in comparison with technology generation in the context of developing countries. And well, this is basically an example of why green innovation is a concept that is a bit different than innovation. This is something that has been very popular in the US until a few years ago, that is lead intense gasoline, and well, it was for sure a very important innovation in the 50s when it was designed, but it granted a long life of the engine and everything, but later on it was discovered that it was very harmful for the environment or for health. So this is something that I always show in order to try to exemplify that not all innovation is really green, no? Because sometimes now, especially with the digital innovation, there is the tendency of saying that every innovation could be classified as green. So, if we wanted to quantify green innovation, where are we? This is something of from the Green Growth Indicator of the OECD, and it shows basically what is the global trends in terms of intellectual property rights. Patents are often used in this field, and the proportion, this is the change of the proportion in environmental technologies compared to the total of technology. If you are on the right side, it seems that the growth rate is higher for environmentally friendly technology compared with environmental neutral technology. So it seems that the situation is more or less good. But at the same time, if we really focus and trying to disaggregate by country, we see that there are a lot of differences. For example, Costa Rica, that is one of the countries that we have in this sample that is very limited, is doing very, very poorly if we compare, for example, with Chile. But all this data on patents have a big problems in Latin America. That is the quantity of patents. If we consider, for example, the green patents per capita, that is another way of presenting the data that were in the previous slide, you see that the three dotted lines that are the lines for Europe, US, and OECD are like in the right scale. So we have like more or less 20 patents per capita, 20 green patents per capita. If you consider what are the Latin American countries that are like the line at the bottom of the graph, you see that they are like plotted on the left-hand axis. That is basically 0.5 patents per capita. And so you see, we are talking about two really different things for a lot of reasons. And this is another clue, another factor that really make us thinking that the indicators, for example, of patents, that are classical indicator of new technology development, are not the indicators that really give us the idea of how is the status of green innovation in Latin America. For this reason, we have started a research project last year that is still ongoing, so I will present to you some very preliminary result, actually, but with the idea of answering some relevant question in order to provide inputs for policy making. The first thing is how can we measure green innovation in Latin America? It is different to measure green innovation in the context of a developing country than in the context of more developed country. That is something that we have already discussed a bit. In case, if it is different, what data do we need in order to measure the phenomenon? Are there successful cases of green innovation? And where and how? Let's try to analyze that. This was our second research questions. The third one is a very generic one that has not been dealt with in Latin America, and while in Europe I have seen it as a lot of literature that is about the drivers of green innovation, of firm green innovation, and also what are their private returns. And finally, in terms of policy, what are good practice? What can we say in terms of good policy practice that can be imitated or replicated in the continent? Obviously, when we think about an innovation process, even if it is something that is related with sustainability and with environment, we still have the same, at least some of the same factors that plays a role when we talk of innovation in general. So what matters? Technology, firms, supply chain, market demand, regulation, in other words, the innovation system. I mean, even if it is something more related with environment, with some modification, we still use the same conceptual framework. Then we arrived to the definition of a theoretical framework for measurement that is very close to what is stated in the Maastricht manual. Actually, we have developed this with René Kemp, but with some very important specificities. So, just to be quick, I would want to focus on three of them. The first one we have already discussed, that is the importance of technology adoption versus technology production. Patents are not really good indicators in general for innovation performance in Latin America, and even worse in terms of green innovation. So the idea is trying to finding some data on what has been the diffusion of technology already present on the market, what usually is the target of technology extension policies. So it's not about research, it's not important having a research or development area or sector in the firms, but it is important to acquire technology already present in the market and change your production process because of that change. Actually, it could be also machinery. It could be many things. The second thing is about the necessity of the availability of complementary technology as something that is an enabler of having green technology. For example, today we were talking about Industry 4.0 and circular economy, if you don't have broadband, many of the technologies that are in the 4.0 revolution obviously are not possible. So it's necessary to have some kind of complementary factors that sometimes are already present in development situation, but not very present in developing area. Let's say, for example, Haiti. Broadband in Haiti is basically inexistent, but the US Embassy. So how can we measure green innovation in Haiti using the same conceptual framework that we are using for Sweden? I mean, I think that it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the third factor, there are many more, but the third more important factor is about human capital. So often there is a focus on advanced human capital and PhD and postgraduate, but we really think that it's important also to focus on vocational education. There is a huge amount of cases where a lot of projects, for example, in terms of renewable energies, needed to import to Latin American human capital, technical human capital from Spain, from Italy, from other parts of Europe or the US because of the lack, for example, of technicians specialized in solar energy. In Chile, for example, where there are a very good conditions for solar and wind energy production, they basically do not have the curricula in order to produce technicians for solar energy production. So there is a mismatch in some way between the academic system and what are the necessities of the economic transition towards a green one. So at what point we are? We have finished the conceptual framework that hopefully will be published this week or the next one. And then we are trying to build a scoreboard, or at least a first try of a scoreboard of Latin America that is definitely not comparable with the scoreboard that exists in Europe, but still will be a first step in trying to compare Latin American countries. So we identified about 20 potential indicators in the broad thematic areas, and it's important that the identification of indicators was obviously in line with our theoretical ideas, but also they were selected in basis on actual availability. So one of the things that we always need to keep in mind is that sometimes it is very nice to think what is theoretically good, but at the end of the day, if we do not deal with reality, we will have a very nice set of indicators but empty, because or just with 4 or 5 countries. If we want to have an indicators for many countries, we need to have this negotiation between theory and reality somehow. And we are now in this process. We hope to have ready the publication by possibly May of next year or June. Before this, something that is important is that we are also trying to generate some data. We talked a lot about innovation surveys, and I was very jealous of the German innovation survey that was presented earlier, where it's already planned a climate change module for the next waves, and there are environmental modules already present for many years, and in many other countries, in Spain and France and others. In Latin America, this is not the case. Only Mexico and Brazil had made some efforts in adding environmental questions to innovation surveys. So we are trying to push Latin American countries to do this. We are financing a special environmental module in Chile. but unfortunately, given what has been the recent fact in Santiago, we are very delayed with this project. But the idea is trying to go and collect data in order also to have the possibility to do more research. And why I said this before this slide is that we think that there is a promising line for the future, not for now, but for the future, that is basically trying to use big green data for building some kind of indicators. This is something that obviously right now could not be possible in many countries because internet, for example, is not very common. But for example, just think if you can use, for example, green skill supply just from web scraping from university websites or using LinkedIn data. We have an agreement with LinkedIn in order to use their data to understand what are the skills needed in the market of green technology and the skills offered by the person on the labor market. So this is something that seems a bit of the future, and it seems very promising because also would allow to skip in some kind of institutional weaknesses that many statistical offices in the region have. So this is what we are doing in terms of indicators. I don't know how much time do I have still left. 5 minutes. So I will try to go very, very quick. There are a couple of case studies that I wanted to show to you. This is one that we worked together with 2 colleagues of the University of Columbia. That is about a firm in Brazil that is called Natura. Possibly some of you knows the brand. It's a very important firm in Brazil that is a producer and retailer of cosmetics and personal care products. And they started to work a lot in terms of eco-packaging. So they started to work with 2 different lines. The first is doing research together with a research partner in order to have recyclable packaging. But at the same time, also they started to have new marketing model in terms, for example, of a refill of the packaging. This is a nice piece of work. It is available on the web. But what I wanted really to tell you is that basically this kind of experience have some kind of commonalities, and it is some really thin line between what is a marketing strategy. For example, Natura really, and all the executive of Natura that was interviewed really underlined that the fact that Natura wanted to sell the brand of Natura as a sustainable brand was part of all the decision and investment done in this area. So it is interesting how in some cases the gains in terms of productivity or in terms of economic performance that we are trying to seek often does not come from savings in the production process, but also come from market reach or new marketing strategy, and this is also part of what it is about. The necessity of collaboration, for example, the network, in this case, top university inside and abroad, is really clear. A lot of times there are insufficient capacities in order to have this kind of solution. But also, in some way, there are a lot of obstacles that do not allow also firms that want to engage in green innovation to really go further. The first thing is for sure the lack of infrastructure in terms of recycling. In Brazil, this is a main problem, so you can have all the recycled the recycle strategy that you want, and Natura has like 3 or 4 different line of materials, one more and one less recyclable. But at the same time, if there is not public effort to organize some kind of collection of residual, it is very complicated. The second thing is that still there is not coordination with other firms operating in the same market. So each firm in some way work in his network of knowledge, but there is not a common effort that could in some way help with the building of infrastructure. If it is just one firm doing lobby for the government to provide a system of recycling is much more complicated. And also, still in the Brazilian market, the consumer is not willing to pay a premium in terms of sustainability. So these are like some of the limitations that we found in the study. Another nice example that I wanted to give to you is about the production of textiles in the maquilas. This is a story for Guatemala. It's a project that is called the New Denim Project, where we are trying to finance upcycling of a residual of textile production, in this case of denim shirts. And it happens also in Costa Rica, for example, with oil. This is news of last week. We just financed the construction of a big plant for oil upcycling. So basically because of adding additives, and it is possible to produce from recycled engine oil an oil that goes to a different quality and can be sold at higher prices than the one that is original. And this is the first factory in Central America, and I mean, we are very, very keen to see the results. So I will try to skip this, that you probably know, but I wanted to go a bit about policy. That is what we usually do. And why it is very complicated to design and implement policy in this area. There are some difficulties that come from the same concept of green innovation and are more or less the same than in innovation policy. You know, multiple actors, the necessity of coordination, also intertemporal, but also between the actors, and also the necessity of a policy mix. So you cannot have supply policy without demand policies, the need for systemic policy, and all of this. Well, what is more difficult, at least in the context of Latin America for us, when we try to design this kind of policy? Well, the main thing is that in this case there are two different systems, because one is the innovation system and one is the environmental system. And these two systems often do not communicate. So the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Science and the Ministry of Production are two completely separated silos. So it is extremely difficult to have coherence in terms of policy and making talk this kind of actors. And it means also that if there is not a vision of state, it is much more complicated to grant the sustainability of policy across the political cycle. In Latin America, not as frequently as in Italy, but also government changes. And well, it's very complicated to have the same policy maintained when there is a change of orientation of the government. So these two different difficulties of coordination, one intertemporal and the other horizontal, are extremely relevant when you arrive at the moment of designing policy. On the other side, also the capacity building of public officer is also key. People that has been trained in environmental policy often really do not understand fully what means innovation policy, what means science and technology, what are the instruments that works in that area. And on the other side, people that knows about innovation policy and science and technology is not very expert in environmental subject. So we are working on this. It's not just designing policy, but implementing this. And really, at the end of the day, when you work in the environmental of a development country, you know, institution and people matters. So it is very important to work on this. And I think that I will end here. There were a lot of things. I will leave the slide, but this was the most important thing that I wanted to say and to finish here. So thank you. I don't know if there are any questions. Yes.
Thank you. I was interested in your slide showing the coffee farm, that coffee industry gets more impact from the climate change in the next 30 years. So, and given the fact that you mentioned that R&D share in Latin America is much lower than the other continent like Europe, then you know, I can assume that solving the climate change problem for the agricultural farm like coffee industry would be difficult. But what about the adaptations for, you know, high temperature or different climate, but still able to, you know, show better harvesting in the agriculture, maybe imitating the good technology used in the US or some other part of the Asia or Europe? Do they show those efforts to the adaptation for the climate change to the agriculture in Latin America, or still they are not showing the interest? Do you see my point? No, I'm asking simply because if they know that the damage is coming, why not adapting? If it's environmental problem like the emissions, I see the, you know, manufacturing industry has no interest for the short-term reason, but agriculture farmer, they should be known, right?
A lot of people do not know, especially small farmers. Big farmers probably know, but are very short-sighted. So I do not see that adaptation and technological transfer from the US or other more advanced country would be a solution in the short term. I think, unfortunately, that it will be like some kind of a shock. For the coffee grower that I showed in the slide, it will be something that will come without a lot of preparation. So my understanding could be a bit catastrophic, but that will be a lot of a big shock in terms of production structure. So there will be some traditional sectors that will be completely destroyed because of the climate change, and will be a push in order to change the economic structure. So, I mean, we will see what happens, but it is difficult that it will be maintained, this structure, with so much emphasis on production of natural resources. But this is my take. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, thanks very much for your presentation. I wonder basically what Europe, what EU member states in particular can learn from Latin America in, well, the adoption of eco-innovations and green technology. Is there something, you know, in your research, but most importantly, I guess, in your practical project experience, are there elements that you could identify where you would say, look, this is something that actually Europe should learn from Latin America?
Good question. I think that yes, there are a lot of things that Europe can learn, maybe from the more advanced countries in Latin America. I mean, I think that Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay has very nice practices that can be shared. Maybe something that is very promising is the concept of bioeconomy and how it is linked with biotechnology, especially in Argentina and Uruguay and the south of Brazil. I think that there is the political willing and the vision of bioeconomy. So just it's very linked to the answer before. I mean, they know about what is the potential richness of biodiversity, and they know that in order to use this richness as a production factor, it is needed research, it is needed science, it is needed innovation. We just financed a couple of months ago the construction of a very high-level research center for biotechnology in Uruguay that will be very focused on cattle production, obviously, because of the production structure. And it is about $40 million research center that the country wanted to invest together with university and private sector. So I think that in terms of bioeconomy, there is something that we as Europeans should look at from Latin America.
Just one remark to carry on with indicators. I guess in Europe we start to count the number of biorefineries and the number of methanization facilities. So on these two indicators, are you going to take a look at it for Latin America? This is the first aspect. And my second question is that when we compared, we used innovation surveys on Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, and we took a look at the importance of multinationals and their crowding out effects. So to what extent are they green or they are not green? Do they help? Or so do you take a look at the importance of these companies in these Latin American countries?
Okay, the answer to both questions is no, but for different reasons. On the first question, the problem with this kind of indicators that could be generated and used in the future, but right now we don't have all the countries reporting. So the idea of this conceptual framework and also an indicator that we are trying to select are indicators that are available in many countries in order to have like maximum common denominator in some way. So it is something that we want to produce, but at this point we want to use. On the second thing, I think that yes, we will try to work on this. Really, depending on the reason for a multinational to invest, if it is more market-oriented or efficiency-seeking, depends also on what is the impact in terms of innovation. There is a really long-standing debate about where do multinationals do research. Usually it is in the headquarters. This was very clear in, for example, in the case of Maquila in Central America. It is less clear when they're looking for market, and in the last 5-6 years there has been a lot of multinationals that started to have research centers in Latin America, for example in Medellin, in Campinas in Brazil, and the same Buenos Aires. So in this case probably the vision could be a bit more optimistic. I mean, this is something that we will look at. For now we don't have evidence. We have some kind of feeling. And really, I think that the thing is positive. I think that at least in Latin America, in terms of environmental rules, multinationals are usually doing better than locals, and also are increases the standard of all the value chain. So it seems to me that at least in the short terms, they have a positive impact. But in this case, I could be optimistic. No, not sure.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering if I'm from Brazil, and I'm very glad to listen at it. This data doesn't surprise me. And I'm interested to know if you consider, like, what is your idea about the role of international institutions for this issue?
Definitely a key role. I couldn't say anything else. But no, I think it's important. In a country as Brazil, it's difficult because the country is very big. So all the international organization financing is like a drop in the sea. So even if, for example, Brazil is the country that is our main borrower, I think that the lending envelope of the IDB is about 3 billion a year in Brazil. That is a lot. It's like 1/4 of all the envelope of lending. It is nothing compared with the national budget of Brazil. So it is a bit more difficult for international organization being influenced. It is much easier if you are in a small country where the lending is a relevant part of the national budget, and you have some kind of stick power in order to make pass this concept. But apart from the lending, so the direct financing, I think that yes, the international organization have a big role in terms of knowledge. So all these things that we are doing, probably nobody would do if the UN, the World Bank, the IDB, the ECRAC, the UN Economic Commission wouldn't be collecting indicators, trying to do research, finance research. It's always a problem, especially in smaller countries. So I really think that they play a role. If not financing, in terms of knowledge cooperation.